Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Today, Barack Obama and three waves of liberalism. My guest, Dr. Charles Kesler, is a professor of government at Claremont McKenna College, a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, and the editor of the indispensable Claremont Review of Books. Charles Kesler, writing recently in the Claremont Review of Books, Barack Obama, quote, has endeavored to do no less than complete and perfect the grand liberal project begun a century ago, close quote. For our purposes now, briefly, in one or two sentences, what's the grand liberal project?
First of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. American liberalism, in the sense that we know it today, has a beginning. It began about 100 years ago in the American progressive period, and it has advanced across the 20th century in a series of waves. The first one being progressivism, the second the New Deal, the third the 60s, broadly speaking, that is the counterculture and the Great Society. And Barack Obama is the fourth wave, or at least he aspires to be the fourth great breakthrough for modern American liberalism.
All right, let's take each of those waves in turn. Segment one, then, the liberal project, wave one. Political liberalism, you write, is the most fundamental wave. It believed in progress.
Yes. You know, sometimes political labels actually tell you something. And the progressive movement is one of those cases where you had a movement that started as an intellectual movement, became a sort of journalistic and political one, and eventually settled down after a long period of contest between being a Republican Party movement and being a Democratic Party movement. It would eventually, by the New Deal, settle down into being the leading ideological component of the Democratic Party. Initially, there were more progressive Republicans than there were progressive
That would be Theodore Roosevelt,
Democrats.
the Theodore Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party.
Case in point, exactly.
Right.
But intellectually, what they had in common was an impatience with the Constitution and the old forms of American politics, which they regarded as outmoded. The typical formulation would be something like this, that the Constitution is an 18th century document which is increasingly inadequate to solve the problems of the 20th century or now the 21st century. And so it either has to be replaced or refined and rehabilitated. And as Woodrow Wilson is perhaps the most celebrated critic of the Constitution. He's the first president to criticize the Constitution under which he served. As a young man, he was interested in actually amending that Constitution to turn it into a sort of parliamentary system. But as a mature political scientist and then, of course, a politician, he decided that you could transform it from within. You could reform the spirit in which the Constitution would be interpreted.
What was it that was inadequate about the old constitutional forms as Wilson saw it?
Well, they led, two things were inadequate about them, I think you could say. One is that they were based on 18th century concepts of a permanent human nature, a fixed sort of human nature. And because of that, the Constitution itself had to be fixed, had to be as permanent as possible to protect the rights of man, which were unchanging because they were aspects of his very nature. And the second thing, which he regarded as improvable about the Constitution, is that the theory of human nature on which it was based was not only old, it was too selfish, too self-interested and egoistic. And as a result, the dominance of political machines and of the spirit of self-interest in American business and so forth, which were great, of course, bête noirs of progressivism. He regarded all that as a logical consequence of the spirit of the Constitution itself. This was self-interestedness working itself out under modern conditions, where you have lots of immigrants arriving all the time in America and who need to be organized politically by machines and so forth and so on.
Now, you write that Wilson introduced a new understanding, or attempted to introduce a new understanding of leadership.
Yes. This is part of his scheme to improve the Constitution or to remodel it from within. the presidency would be the key. That if you could get a president like himself and like the apostolic succession of great democratic progressive presidents since then, including now, I suppose, Barack Obama, they could pour new wine into the old bottle of the Constitution. And the new wine was a notion of leadership, that their job was not to run the constitutional machinery, to fulfill the duties of the executive office per se, but to lead public opinion, to lead it into the future, to move American politics forward, to open it to the salutary influences of progress. Mm-hmm. And so to do this by taking the American people in hand, showing them the New Jerusalem that awaits them in the future, and organizing them for that march into the future.
So in those early years of the 20th century, one of the last proponents of a couple of the last proponents of the old constitutional order would have been William Howard Taft and Calvin Coolidge. And these were chief executives who were content to administer the federal government, which was then still relatively modest by our standards today, to execute the duties specifically enjoined on them as chief executives by the Constitution, and otherwise to leave it alone. By contrast, you've got Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, who want to take America by the collar and drag it in there. And Wilson, indeed, wants to remake all the world after the First World War.
Yes, that's right.
It's a difference in vision and scope and level of energy that they believe is fitted to the job of president.
In fact, Wilson is the first president really to use this word, which is now ubiquitous in our politics, vision. To be a leader, you have to have a vision of the future, and you have to sort of communicate that vision to the unanointed, the mass public in the United States, make them believe in it by making them believe in you and your prophetic ability to see where the country is going, and all you do is pose as the modest prime minister, in a way, conducting us to the future, to this new vision.
Is this a fair summary then? Phase one of liberalism sees the Constitution as an instrument for rousing the people and leading them to a great national destiny, whereas the old constitutional order would say, no, you don't understand. William Howard Taft, Calvin Coolidge, the constitutional order is constructed to leave people alone, let Americans be.
Yes, although I would say that there was always a notion of national destiny, or of the Republican significance of America for the world and for humanity. But that significance was found in the fulfillment of, as it were, the permanent requirements of human nature.
Segment 2, the second wave of liberalism, economic liberalism. You've written, Charles, quote, "What is most characteristic about the second wave of liberalism is the doctrine of social and economic rights." Explain.
Yes. From the first wave, you get what we now call the living Constitution, the notion that
Antonin Scalia all but spits us.
Yes, that's right. And for us, this term means something that judges believe in and apply, activist judges. But for Wilson, who really formulates this theory, it's a theory of the whole government. Every branch of government has a part to play in opening up the Constitution. It's really a sort of Darwinian notion that new times present new challenges. If the Constitution, like any living organism, is to survive, it has to be able to adapt to its new environment. And it can't be restricted by the separation of powers, by checks and balances, by these old 18th century ideas of limited government. It's got to be a living government. The Constitution has to be a living document. And the government has to be able to change in structure and function with the changes in public opinion and changes in the social and economic problems confronting it. So what the New Deal adds to this is
Franklin Roosevelt, 1930s, this is a couple of decades after Wilson.
That's right, is an economic spin in which the notion of the living Constitution now translates into a whole new category of rights that have to be guaranteed under the Constitution and by the government. And these are what FDR sometimes called the Second Bill of Rights, or the Economic Bill of Rights. And they include things like a right to a job, a right to a vacation from the job, a right to health care, a right to a home, a right to an education, all of these sort of social and economic benefits are things, he says, which in modern America are as fundamental as the inalienable rights of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The only difference being that the old rights essentially meant that the government had a duty to leave you alone and only to protect your life and liberty against other human beings who might try to rob you or kill you or intrude upon your property. The new rights require government to be much more energetic, active, positive in its approach, and essentially to nationalize all of American politics, because these rights, which are going to go out to individuals and groups of Americans, retirees in the case of Social Security and so forth, all come to a head in Washington, and the stream of benefits flows from Washington.
You write, quote, "The theory of the new economic rights is that the old rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, are not worth anything until you have a certain economic and social equality granted to everyone and guaranteed by the government. This is a very bad argument, but it turned out to be a very successful argument." Bad and successful. I'd like you to address both of those. Why is it a bad argument? Surely there is at least an intuitive appeal. Who wants freedom of speech when he's starving? Mm-hmm. Who cares about freedom of religion when he hasn't got a job, right?
Yes, that's right.
So why is it a bad argument?
Does it follow that your right to freedom of religion, let's say, or freedom of worship, is being frustrated because you don't have a church and you want the government to build you a church because the flavor you're interested in is not available in your market? That's really the transformation. I mean, the older understanding, of course, recognized that having a decent home and decent medical care and so forth, education, these were good things, but it refrained from calling them rights. Because when you call them rights, you necessarily create duties to fulfill these rights. And as government grows across the 20th century, let's say, as more and more rights are created, someone has got to pay to guarantee your health care, your home, your job, your vacation from the job, and so forth. Who is it that has the duties to pay for your rights?
That is the famous man behind the tree. Don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the man behind the tree.
Well, and it's really what Hayek was talking about when he spoke of the road to serfdom. Going back to a society like feudalism where duties are primary, and rights are exemptions from duties that government grants to its favored clients.
Right.
And our freedoms disappear in those sort of comprehensive duties. And, if your right to consent to taxes, let's say, a very old right, understood as a derivation of the old natural rights of the Declaration of Independence, when that right comes into conflict with your duty to pay taxes to provide all of these benefits that have been promised, which takes precedence? And increasingly, I think, in the politics of the 20th century, the duty takes precedence. And it's
indeed, it is. This current administration seeks to extend it to the Cayman Islands and elsewhere.
Very much so.
All right. But you say it turned out to be a very successful argument.
Yes. Part of FDR's political genius was to weave the new concept of rights together with the old concept of rights, and to cover up a little bit its novelty and its radicalism. And he did so along the lines that you've just outlined, that of course the old rights are still there. These are just new rights we're adding to the old rights. They don't take away from them, they add to them. And in fact, to vindicate the old rights, we need these new rights. Because a man without a job, what does the right to vote mean to a man who's without a job? What does the right to own property mean to a man who has no property?
Right.
And that was a very successful combination in selling what was in fact a very new and in a way revolutionary idea as a continuation of an old idea.
Segment 3. Liberalism, Wave 3. Cultural liberalism. The sexual revolution of the 60s, Charles Kesler writes, quote, freed up everyone to pursue passion without the restraints of reason, close quote. Explain.
Well, again, if you start from the premise of the New Deal style rights, that because individuals can't be counted on to provide their own housing or their own education or their own health care, government has to do it for them. The purpose of this is for government to take charge of your necessities, as it were, or at least what are called necessities, and to let you live in freedom, a new kind of freedom, which really is a kind of freedom from responsibility, or freedom from virtue in the old sense. I mean, it took virtues to, build a life for yourself, provide for your family, get a decent house, send your kids to good schools, and so forth.
Now we're being offered the freedom of the nursery school.
Instead of the virtues that went with the old style of freedom, the new kind of freedom is really liberation. It's liberation from virtue, from the kind of character you needed to be free in the older understanding.
Charles, how is it, beautifully put, you just summed up a huge amount of thought in a couple of sentences there. How is it that we understand, we feel the connections between these three waves of liberalism? But we know that Woodrow Wilson would have been appalled by the Woodstock hippie thing and Franklin Roosevelt. I don't even know what to call it.
As with FDR, yes.
FDR had some marital problems, but he was a very prim man. He loved the Book of Common Prayer. He went to church. He was a man of traditional morality and even traditional aesthetics. How do we understand what took place in the 60s as a third wave of what is somehow the same thing?
Well, I would say this. You're right that in some ways the character of a Woodrow Wilson or an FDR is better than their principles. And what happens is that their...
Remind me to keep you on my side.
Their insistence on these, let's say, higher standards or more traditional kinds of standards corrodes over time against the idea that, after all, there is progress. We assume that there is progress. The progressive assumption is that the future will be better than the present, even as the present is better than the past. And so who are we, in the end, to say that human liberation will not take different, unusual forms, sexual liberation, the drug revolution, whatever, of the 1960s? Perhaps this is, in fact, the kind of experiments that the growth of human personality requires. And that's really how the 60s, I think, comes about.
It seems to me the one place one sees it is in the family of the Kennedys, where you have Edward Moore Kennedy, who has, at this stage, presumably in the last months of his existence among us, but at this stage of his career, he's championed every aspect, most notably one of the champions of abortion on demand. The very notion, if Patrick Joseph Kennedy Sr., his father, or even John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his older brother, had thought that their baby of the family would end up as a champion of abortion, they'd have been appalled. Isn't that right?
Yes. No, I think that's right.
This takes place within a generation and a half or two generations.
Well, and that example, of course, raises the question I was skirting earlier, which is, in fact, the old rights and the new rights don't just peacefully coexist. The new rights come at a huge cost in terms of the old rights, because some of these old rights, like the right to life, under the aegis of the new rights, looks less and less absolute, or less and less permanent and compelling.
Explain one instance of that. Yes. You've written, quote, "Freeing up everyone equally turns out to be bad for women," close quote.
Yes. Well, it turns out to be bad for women because women and men are different in certain ways. I mean, they're equally human beings, deserving of the kinds of rights that human beings are possessed of.
You're being old-fashioned. You're asserting unchanging difference.
That's right. Exactly. But it was always understood that though they were beings of equal worth, they were beings of a different fate, because nature had made them different and complementary, of course, but not the same. And so the attempt to liberate women from femininity and also to liberate men from masculinity, I think, has been the source of great unhappiness. Undoubtedly, there were aspects of women's condition and lifestyles that had to change in the 60s and 50s because the economy was changing, society was changing, new kinds of opportunities were opening up for educated human beings, whether they were men or women, and that would have an effect on traditional families that we shouldn't discount. But still, the ideological kick that the 60s added was a kind of revulsion at the old roles of mother and even homemaker and so forth, and to regard these as passé and déclassé at the same time. The avant-garde was moving away from that. And it was easier for the avant-garde to handle the new lifestyles, of course, than it was for women in the middle class and the working class to handle them, because the disadvantages that cropped up could be more easily handled if you had a higher income than if you didn't.
One particular artifact, political artifact of this third wave of liberalism, cultural liberalism, identity politics. You've written, left to ourselves, our identities, the thing we're supposed to be liberating, is not complete. We have to join groups. Identity rights now become very important in politics. Briefly explicate that assertion.
Right. Well, the politics of sort of liberation, cultural liberation, of which we saw in the 60s, well, one side of the 60s, was meant initially to liberate individuals, but individuals are weak and they need the support of, they need support groups, as we learned to say back then. And so women's liberation couldn't be the liberation of individual women alone. It had to be the liberation of all women, the sisterhood. And the same thing with the other aspects of the sexual revolution. Individual homosexuals could not be fully liberated. They needed the support of their peers. And so what began as individual kinds of social and economic liberation became group forms of social and economic liberation. And that's really the logic of the entitlement state, of the entitlement rights that came out of the second wave of liberalism, that rights really are privileges that government grants to broad categories of people, not to individuals. That's feudal. But the modern version of that same notion is that these are rights that go to identity groups of one kind or another who claim that they have been repressed and need now to receive from government the support necessary to be free.
Segment 4, enter Barack Obama. Excuse me, I return to the assertion with which we began, which is that Barack Obama, according to Charles Kesler, has, quote, endeavored to do no less than complete and perfect the grand liberal project begun a century ago. So let's just go through these. Barack Obama and political liberalism. What does he wish to extend, to complete, to perfect?
Well, I think he intends concretely to turn the court back into a Warren-era kind of activist court and to break the 5-4 logjam that has characterized the court for a generation now. Sotomayor's nomination is an indication of this. I would expect...
you don't think he stepped on a banana peel? It looks as though her decisions are actually pretty narrowly construed. She abides by precedent.
Yeah, well...
She said some silly things, but she doesn't seem to have written silly decisions.
It would be a wonderful irony, and long overdue, if a liberal appointed to the court moved right.
About time for that to happen to their side.
Instead of Republican appointees moving left, which has been the almost universal rule for 50 years or more.
Right.
So if he slips on a banana peel, that's great. I think it's our turn to have somebody slip on a banana peel. But his intention is certainly to restore the living Constitution to its full health and vigor.
That will be enough out of you, Mr. Justice Scalia. We have a living Constitution, and that's that.
He actually admits this in his second book, The Audacity of Hope. He has a long sort of passage in which he debates theories of interpreting the Constitution. But in the end, surprise, surprise, he's in favor of the living Constitution.
Yes, right. Yeah. All right. So in what way then, wave 2, the economic liberalism, in what way does he wish to complete and perfect that project?
Well, he wants to achieve what every Democratic president has tried to achieve since FDR, which is national health care. This is the great, long-sought goal to complete, as it were, the entitlement state. And he has a very good chance of succeeding, I'm afraid. This summer I think will tell. It's not inevitable, but he seems to have the best shot of any Democratic president so far since FDR in doing this.
And the third wave, the wave of cultural liberalism, how does Barack Obama want to perfect and complete that?
Well, here I think what's interesting about him is that he has downplayed the cultural agenda and has in fact stepped back, and deliberately so, from the in-your-face social radicalism of the 60s. I think he understands that was a tremendous political liability for liberalism and for Democrats, and that he wants to cool those issues and to demonstrate a new maturity in the Democratic Party. And he's
stylistic or
stylistically, more than substantively, but a little of both.
So he appears. We were talking earlier about how appalled by the sexual revolution Woodrow Wilson or FDR might have been. But here you have Barack Obama, as best one can tell, a very close and well-functioning marriage, two absolutely adorable, old-fashioned nuclear family, and not a hint of any scandal surrounding them.
Right.
It's quite on sort of the ethical or moral scale, he's really quite old-fashioned.
Yes, no, and I think that's designed to, in part, to represent the new maturity, as it were, of the Democratic Party on these subjects. He's an adult, he's a grown-up, but he can show you that grown-ups can be cool. You don't have to be a kid like in the 60s to be cool. The party, we've progressed since then, and a certain amount of self-restraint that goes with liberation is not only necessary, but it's attractive, and he certainly embodies that. At the same time, of course, he has ticked off every box on the cultural liberal agenda, with the possible exception of gay marriage, but who knows in 6 years where he will actually be on that question. But on everything else, abortion, with one other possible exception, I should say, in his favor, and that is religion, where, like Bill Clinton and like Jimmy Carter, he has been more open to using religious language, to welcoming certain aspects of religion back into the public square. But otherwise, he's a pretty conventional cultural liberal, I'd say.
You note that as president, Ronald Reagan could still quote passages from Whittaker Chambers' 1952 book, Witness. That's the great book in which Whittaker Chambers describes becoming an underground communist in this country in the 30s and breaking with the party.
Yes.
All right. Here's the passage. One of the passages Ronald Reagan could quote. This is Chambers, when I took my little sling and aimed at communism, that is to say, he broke with the party, I also hit that great socialist revolution, which, in the name of liberalism, has been inching its ice cap over the nation for 2 decades. He wrote that in 1952, so we'd have to say that if he's right about that, the ice cap has now been inching over the nation for 8 decades.
Yes.
Right? All right, so here's a fundamental question. You write about the grand liberal project. And the question I have is there really a grand liberal project? Or is it just a kind of somehow or other, it's a set of impulses at this stage? In other words, if you shook Barack Obama awake in the middle of the night and said, quick, you can have everything you want, what would he ask for? What's the culmination? When do they know they've gotten when the ice cap covers the country completely, what will it look like?
Well, part of the genius of liberalism is never defining what the terminus ad quem is. You'll never find a liberal saying, if only government were 50% of GDP, we'd be happy.
Yeah.
This is all we want is what Sweden has. They'll never actually define that. And partly that's because they are progressives. I mean, they really are progressives. They don't know, they can't know where history is going to take us exactly. They are confident that it's going to be in a more socialized direction, greater, deeper social democracy. But they cannot specify, like Marx could specify, what the end state is going to look like.
Right.
That gives them it's all a kind of to use a mathematical and a Buckley-esque term, asymptotic approximation of democratic perfection at the end of history. But you never quite get to the end, and so there's always more reform to be done. I would say, though, that mentioning the ice caps, I mean, environmentalism is one of those things which has added to the armory of liberal argument and ideas and opened up a whole new category to justify government's growth and intervention. And Obama is exploiting it fairly successfully right now.
Segment 5, what are conservatives to do? Charles Kesler, quote, "It does seem as if the conservative movement is longing for a sort of conservative Viagra." Close quote. Dr. Kesler, explain that.
Well, this program is called Uncommon Knowledge, right? I don't think it's a secret that conservatism is knocked back on its heels right now, and is dispirited and somewhat in the doldrums. And in a way, the reason for that is that we became, in a way, too progressive. We were confident that the victory that Reagan won was a permanent victory, and that I think that history was moving in our direction, and all we had to do was sort of collect on the down payment, on the initial gains that Reagan had made, and simply ride those. And Gingrich's success in 1994 added to the sense that a new conservative era was opening up, and the long-sought emerging Republican majority was about to really emerge for a generation. Gingrich was himself in those days very eloquent on this subject. I mean, he used to talk about the third wave.
He had his waves too.
That's right, exactly. Very much like the progressives, that the microchip and the new computer technology of the age would guarantee, as a political parallel, the breakdown of traditional bureaucracy, the demassification of the government, the unleashing of individual initiative, and so forth, and thus the Republican ascendancy for the next generation or two.
Right.
Well, some aspects of that came true, of course, technologically and so forth, but politically, no. There was no determinism from the economy and technology to politics. And I think
as political contributions here in Silicon Valley would demonstrate,
yes,
the people who are getting rich off that microchip are now giving money to, or gave money to Al Gore and Barack Obama and the Democratic Party.
Well, but Gore did invent the internet, so I mean, there's that.
Charles, can I just ask, why, this is an anthropological question. I'm asking you a question about human beings. Why hadn't the decisive victory been won when the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991? We had, by that point, had decades of experience between limited government and free markets on the one hand and command economies on the other. And if you want to take the Soviet Union out of the picture, just look at Western Europe, where you have a much larger state than in the United States, and you have 3-4 decades now of economic stagnation, unemployment are up around 9-10%. Why is it even an argument that we need more market participation in healthcare, not less? Why?
Well,
doesn't this shake your faith in democracy here?
There's a strategic and a tactical answer, I think. The strategic answer is that the victories of liberalism in the past century are so much deeper and changed American politics so much more than conservatives, I think, are willing to admit, that we're up against a process, a new understanding, let's put it this way, of the state and its purposes and so forth, that's 100 years old. The 20th century is really the liberal century. Conservatives came on the scene only very late. I mean, there was no organized conservative movement until the 50s, really when Bill Buckley and National Review began.
So when Justice Antonin Scalia excoriates Warren and the Warren Court, he's actually stopping short about 5 decades.
Yes.
The notion of the living constitution, that was the Warren Court, it's harvest time for an intellectual notion. The beginnings of that notion date back 4 or 5 decades earlier.
Yes. But really Scalia, I mean, is an interesting case in point here. In many ways, Scalia is a New Deal judge. I mean, he accepts the New Deal settlement. That is, he doesn't have as an ambition reining in Congress's ability to regulate the economy.
Right.
He is an anti-Warren Court.
He can't do everything,
judge.
Charles.
No, he can't do everything. But he doesn't have, as an agenda, you might say, going back before the New Deal Court. And for him, everything is really a question of whether the judges should do it or not, or leave it to the democratic process. That's really the argument of the New Deal Court and of the progressives in their attitude towards the court, that the court should get out of the way of reform, of reforming liberalism, and stick to its own work, which is to handle the civil rights question and maybe a few procedural questions about democracy. But to leave government to grow, more or less, as the people or as the people are alleged to want it to grow, and as they express their desires through congressional legislation.
Right. Charles, final question. You said that of Barack Obama's inaugural address, quote, "The speech was a pastiche of themes adapted from FDR and Ronald Reagan, the last 2 presidents to pull off major electoral realignments. What Obama hopes for is a similar breakthrough for the forces of liberalism in this generation." We're out of time, so I have to ask for a yes or a no, maybe to the elaboration to the extent of a single sentence. Will he be able to pull it off? Will Barack Obama pull it off?
I don't think so.
Charles Kesler of Claremont McKenna College and the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thank you for joining us.